I was standing in my wedding suit when my fiancé walked into the tailor's shop holding another man's hand. The stylist had just finished pinning the jacket at my shoulders. Navy silk, custom cut, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's cars and felt like being wrapped in a second skin. The fitting room was all warm wood and soft lighting, the kind of place that charged by the hour and made you feel like you belonged in a magazine spread. Through the three-way mirror, I watched Julian Ashford stop in the doorway with Theo Vance tucked against his arm, casual as a Sunday morning. Julian didn't look guilty. He looked mildly inconvenienced, like he'd come to reschedule a dentist appointment he'd forgotten about. "The wedding doesn't need to be canceled," he said, straightening his cuff. "We'll just move it back a month." The stylist's fingers froze against my shoulder. Theo wore a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car, and a soft, apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't look at the suit. He looked at me through the mirror, his expression gentle enough that anyone else might mistake it for kindness. I'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone who'd already won and was trying to be gracious about it. I turned around slowly, letting my hands fall from the jacket. "Why?" Julian had clearly rehearsed his answer. Theo shifted closer to him, a subtle press of shoulder against bicep that was probably unconscious and definitely calculated. "Theo is moving to Seattle next month. When we were 17, we made a promise. If one of us was about to start a new life but still wondered what might have happened between us, we'd spend 30 days together and finally answer the question." He gave a small laugh, as if the whole thing were charming. "We'd live together, cook, run errands, watch movies. Just normal couple things. 1 month, Noah. Then I come back, and the wedding goes ahead exactly as planned. Don't turn it into something it isn't." The shop went so quiet that I could hear the soft rush of the air conditioning. The sales consultant lowered her eyes and began rearranging a tray of cufflinks that did not need rearranging. The stylist still held my sleeve, her fingers trembling slightly against the silk. Everyone in the room understood how humiliating his request was. Everyone except Julian. I looked at Theo. "You'll be living together." Theo pressed his lips into a sympathetic smile. "I know it sounds difficult, Noah, but Julian and I have known each other for more than 20 years. If something were going to happen, it would have happened already. We just need closure. I'm not trying to take your place as Mr. Ashford. Where will you stay?" I asked. Julian's forehead creased. "Do we really need to get this specific?" "I have the penthouse by the river," Theo said quietly. "I haven't been sleeping well, and Julian promised he'd help me through this." The last stake in my chest went cold. Our engagement party had been 7 days earlier. A ballroom overlooking the harbor. Julian had held my hand in front of our families, business partners, employees, and half a dozen society reporters. He had promised loyalty, respect, and a shared future. He had stood there in his impeccable charcoal suit, his wintergreen alpha scent steady and reassuring, and told everyone who mattered that I, Noah Bennett, 28 years old, Omega, heir to a fortune I'd spent my entire life trying to earn rather than inherit, was the person he wanted to build his life with. That public commitment had also affected our companies. Ashford Development had received preferred partner status with Bennett Capital. The Harbor District redevelopment moved faster. Several vendors offered Ashford 90-day terms instead of 30. A conditional corporate guarantee from Bennett was being reviewed by our board, though it had not yet been signed or submitted to the bank. My family had not traded me for a business deal. I had chosen Julian. But when two heirs publicly committed to building a life together, the boards reasonably treated the relationship as one factor in a long-term alliance. Julian wanted to suspend his promise while assuming every benefit created by that promise would remain in place. Apparently, there were two kinds of commitments in his world. The one he made to me was for cameras and investors. The one he made to Theo at 17 was sacred. 1 month, I said. Relief loosened his shoulders. 30 days. That's all. You've always been rational, Noah. You understand what's best for everyone. The formal invitations haven't gone out yet, so changing the date will be easy. When I come back, I'll make it up to you. I nodded. All right. Triumph flashed in Theo's eyes before he hit it. Julian stepped toward me and lifted his hand, reaching for my hair the way he always did when he believed he'd successfully talked me into giving up something. His alpha scent intensified, warm and familiar, the pheromones designed to soothe and reassure. I'd let him do that 1,000 times before, let his scent wash over me and quiet the part of my brain that knew better. Not this time. I moved aside. But the wedding doesn't need to be postponed, I said. He stopped. What does that mean? I removed the suit jacket and placed it in the stylist's hands. Then I reached for the shirt beneath, unbuttoning it with steady fingers. You can honor your old promise. I'll honor my own decision. The wedding will take place 29 days from now. Julian stared at me, then gave a dismissive shake of his head. Noah, don't be dramatic. I'm not. I changed back into my white shirt, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency. From my handbag, I took out the gold signet ring his mother had given me at our engagement party, the ring that had belonged to Julian's late grandfather, passed down through 3 generations of Ashford Alphas. Mrs. Ashford had told me it would go only to the future Omega of the family. She'd pressed it into my palm with tears in her eyes and said I was the son she'd always wanted. I set the velvet box in Julian's palm. Return this to your mother. For the first time, the confidence left his face. His alpha scent flickered, uncertainty bleeding through the carefully maintained calm. It's 1 month, Noah. Do you really need to give that back? I didn't answer him. I turned to the consultant instead. Cancel the suit. Keep whatever deposit the contract requires. I'm not asking for special treatment. Then I picked up my bag and walked between them. As I passed, Theo called softly, Noah. I paused without turning around. Julian will come back after the month is over. Then you should remember to leave the door unlocked. Boston had just come through a spring rain. Beads of water clung to the shop windows, and the pavement on Newberry Street reflected the gray sky like 1,000 shattered mirrors. My driver pulled up at the curb. I slid into the back seat and shut the door. Only then did I notice the pale line around my ring finger. I'd handed my engagement ring to the stylist before trying on the suit and forgotten to put it back on. The skin beneath was paler than the rest, a ghost of a commitment that had been worn for 4 years. I stared at it for a long moment, watching the city blur past the window. I took out my phone and called Maya Collins, my chief of staff. Call legal, the risk committee, and the investment committee. Emergency meeting at 2. Every exception Ashford Development received because of my engagement to Julian goes back into standard review. Maya was silent for half a second. She'd been with me for 6 years. She knew the sound of my voice when I was making a decision versus when I was reacting, including the conditional guarantee for Harbor District, including it. It hasn't been executed or submitted to the bank, so withdrawing it isn't a breach. Existing contracts remain in force. Verbal assurances and signed concessions are revoked. Bennett Capital will not retaliate against Ashford Development, and Bennett Capital will no longer make exceptions for it. My voice did not shake. Bennett Capital was not my private bank account. Even after Julian humiliated me in public, I could not use the company as a weapon. Ashford's financial risks had existed long before that morning. The board had tolerated more exposure because the 2 companies were expected to become closely supervised long-term partners. If the personal relationship was no longer stable, the commercial decision had to return to data, contracts, and fiduciary duty. Maya understood immediately. I'll have legal prepare the full basis. Include liquidity impact and litigation exposure. Any director who disagrees gets the floor at 2. Understood. Noah, are you? I'm fine. Just get it done. She didn't push. That was why she'd lasted 6 years. At 2 o'clock, 11 directors filled the top-floor boardroom at Bennett Capital. 7 were independent. My last name did not guarantee their support. A senior director pushed the preliminary memo toward me. Noah, personal conduct is personal conduct. Ashford CEO can be a fool without giving us the right to change corporate policy overnight. I agree, I said. That answer surprised him. I signaled to our chief financial officer, and the screen behind me lit up with 2 years of Ashford Development's debt structure, delayed receivables, short-term borrowing, and dependence on Bennett's credit support. These risks did not appear this morning, I said. The board approved preferred treatment because Harbor District was expected to be governed through a joint management committee after the marriage. Ashford's project cash flow and certain operating assets would have been subject to Bennett oversight. I advanced to the next slide. Julian Ashford has unilaterally requested a suspension of the engagement while failing to disclose the change in relationship status to any lender or partner. He expects Bennett to continue bearing credit costs while he conducts a 30-day personal experiment. Several directors frowned. Others returned to the numbers, their eyes scanning columns of figures that painted an increasingly uncomfortable picture. The guarantee letter has not been signed. Withdrawing it is not a breach. Existing consulting agreements remain active. Ashford will simply lose preferred payment status and 90-day vendor terms. It can provide additional collateral and undergo ordinary underwriting like any other partner. I looked around the table. Bennett will not tell a bank to deny Ashford a loan. We will not pressure a vendor to terminate a contract. We are only declining to provide exceptional support to a company whose risk structure is no longer aligned with the assumptions behind that support. I didn't ask the directors to vote for my dignity. I asked them to vote for the company's risk exposure. The distinction mattered. I was Noah Bennett, CEO, and my personal humiliation was not a line item on the balance sheet. After 2 hours of legal review and hostile questioning, the resolution passed 8-2, with one abstention. The director who had challenged me first closed his folder. This wasn't an emotional decision. No, I said. It wasn't. The moment Julian said, "You've always been rational, Noah," I finally understood what his version of everyone meant. It always included him. It never included my dignity. I stayed in the boardroom after everyone left, staring at the empty seats. The rain had started again, streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see my reflection in the glass. A man in a white shirt, tie loosened, face composed. I looked like I was in control. I felt like I was holding myself together with sheer force of will. After the meeting, I stayed in my office until the rain stopped. The sky over Boston cleared to a pale, watery blue, and the city gleamed like it had been polished. I opened my contacts and found a number I had not called for 2 years. Marcus Whitmore. Marcus and I had not met through our parents. 5 years earlier, when I was still working in Bennett Capital's risk division, he'd been Whitmore Global's youngest executive vice president. We first met during a failed acquisition. He rejected the proposal I'd spent 3 months building. The next morning, I stood in a regulatory hearing and told him he'd underestimated compliance costs by nearly 40%. We argued for 6 hours. Then we wrote a new deal neither side loved, which was exactly why it worked. Over the next several years, we worked together on logistics, medical devices, and urban redevelopment. We also publicly disagreed at industry panels and privately tore apart each other's financial models. 3 years ago, when Bennett's European warehouse division faced a coordinated liquidity attack and several partners withdrew, everyone waited to see whether I would fail. Marcus alone insisted that Whitmore honor the existing contract. He didn't use the crisis to force down our price. Later, I asked him why. He said, "I read your risk report. Anyone willing to put the worst-case scenario on page 1 is not gambling with a partner's money." That was the first time I realized he saw me not as a Bennett son, but as the judgment written into 300 pages of analysis. He didn't care about my designation, Omega, Air, whatever. He cared about the quality of my thinking. 2 years ago, after a project dinner, he'd asked whether I would consider a relationship that was not limited to work. I'd already been dating Julian. I refused. Marcus didn't argue. He simply said, "Your choice belongs to you. The project will not change, and I will not use work as an excuse to get close to you." For 2 years, he kept that promise. He never pushed. He never lingered too long at meetings. He never sent the kind of text that could be interpreted as more than professional. He simply waited, and in waiting, he showed me more respect than Julian ever had in 4 years. The phone rang once. "Noah, His voice was low and calm. The background was silent, as if he were alone in an empty conference room. Through the window, I could see his office building across the financial district, a tower of glass and steel that caught the last of the afternoon light. I looked out at the wet Boston skyline. The question you asked me 2 years ago, is it still open? There was a 2-second pause. He didn't sound triumphant. He didn't ask what Julian had done. My answer has not changed, he said. But yours has to be confirmed. Are you calling because you want revenge, or because you are genuinely making a different choice? I stared at the pale ring mark on my finger. A different choice. Are you sure it isn't anger? I'm willing to meet you before I give a final answer. All right. He paused. I'm at Whitmore headquarters. Whatever you say tonight stays in the room. If your answer is no, our current business remains exactly as it is. For the first time all day, the tension in my shoulders eased. I didn't go to Whitmore headquarters immediately. First, I went to the penthouse Julian and I had planned to use after the wedding. The Back Bay property belonged to the Ashford family, but I'd spent weeks redesigning it around Julian's routines. I'd chosen the height of the dining table, the layout of the kitchen drawers, the lighting by the front door, and the shelves in the study. Every detail had been a love letter I'd written in furniture and fabric. The doorman recognized me and let me up without question. The elevator ride felt interminable, each floor number ticking past like a countdown. When I opened the door, a pair of pale gray slippers sat beside the shoe cabinet. Theo had already moved in. 2 unfinished coffees stood on the living room table. One cup had a faint red print on the rim. His suitcase rested beside the sofa, not fully closed, a silk robe spilling through the gap. I wasn't angry. I was almost impressed by how quickly their symbolic 30-day experiment had become real. They'd wasted no time. The paint wasn't even dry on Julian's promise to love me forever, and already he was playing house with someone else. I went to the study and packed my private documents, passport copies, project notebooks, and a few old photographs. I opened the closet and pulled down my suits, my shirts, the small collection of personal items I'd accumulated over 4 years. It fit into 3 boxes. 3 boxes for 4 years of my life. Then I lifted a pothose plant from the windowsill. I'd bought it on my first day at Bennett Capital. It had followed me through 3 offices and 2 apartments. Lately, I'd spent so much time planning the wedding that I'd forgotten to water it. Several older leaves had turned yellow. I'd been so focused on making everything perfect for Julian that I'd neglected the small things that had nothing to do with him. Julian came home a few minutes later. The moment he saw the boxes in my hands, his face tightened. "What are you doing here?" "Taking my files and personal things. You're coming back in a month." "There's no reason to move everything." I placed the last notebook in the box. This penthouse never belonged to me. Now the future attached to it doesn't either. His expression darkened. "Noah, can you stop trying to punish me? I told you exactly what this is. Theo and I are closing a chapter. It won't affect our marriage." I clipped one dead leaf from the pothose. "You explained yourself very clearly. I heard every word. Then why are you packing?" "Because I don't leave my belongings in someone else's trial marriage penthouse." Theo appeared in the bedroom doorway. He'd changed into soft lounge clothes and was holding one of the mugs I'd bought for Julian and me, the ones with the tiny gold initials that had taken me 3 weeks to track down. "Noah, please don't misunderstand. I was going to take the guest room, but Julian said the main bedroom was quieter. I haven't been sleeping, and we really are only." "You don't need to explain." Julian cut in. "Theo's insomnia has been severe. Why are you obsessing over details?" I looked at Theo's clothes, then at the open bedroom door. The wedding guest list I'd organized the night before still sat on the bedside table. Some relationships didn't need 30 days to replace you. Sometimes one afternoon was enough. I sealed the last box and picked up the plant. "Julian, you chose the 30 days. I respect your decision. 1 month from now, where am I supposed to pick you up?" he asked before he could stop himself. "You won't need to." I walked past him, the boxes heavy in my arms. As the door closed behind me, I heard Theo ask in a low voice, "Is he angry?" Julian answered with complete confidence. "He needs time. When I go back, I'll apologize and he'll calm down. Noah would never really leave me. The closing door cut off the rest. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the polished wood. For years, and he still didn't know me at all. Whitmore Global's headquarters rose above Boston's financial district like a monument to ambition. When I entered the top-floor conference room, Marcus had been waiting for 20 minutes. He hadn't gathered our parents, lawyers, or directors to pressure me. There were only 2 business proposals on the table, a pot of tea, and a closed folder. We hadn't been alone together in 2 years. He seemed quieter than I remembered. His charcoal suit was simple, his cuffs neat. His gaze moved to the pot hose in my arms. "It needs water," he said. I neglected it. He asked an assistant for a tray and a glass, then poured half a cup into the dry soil himself. His fingers were steady, his movements careful. "The roots are still green," he said. "Give it time." I watched the water disappear into the dirt. It was a better comfort than anything else I'd heard that day. We sat across from each other. I told him exactly what Julian had proposed. I didn't minimize it, and I didn't make it uglier than it was. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked one question. "What role do you want me to play? Future husband? Business partner?" I paused. "Not the man who destroys Julian for me." He nodded once. "I can agree to that. I will not bring Bennett Capital into the marriage. Our premarital assets stay separate. Our companies remain governed by their own boards. Joint projects follow market rules. Of course, if we disagree, I keep the right to say no. Marriage is not Whitmore acquiring Bennett, and it is not me escaping from Ashford into a more powerful family. I have never thought of you as an acquisition." He slid the folder toward me. Inside was not a family alliance proposal. It was a prenuptial agreement and a conflict of interest framework drafted by independent counsel. Premarital property would remain separate. Neither spouse could demand a transfer of shares. Joint investments required approval from both boards. Relatives could not interfere with hiring or operations. Public relations teams could not describe either spouse as an accessory to the other. If the marriage ended, business interests would separate through a predefined exit mechanism. There was even a clause stating that if we had children, neither of us could use inheritance, caregiving, or family reputation to force the other out of a career. The signature lines were blank. "When did you prepare this?" I asked. "The first version was drafted 2 years ago." I looked up. He didn't avoid my eyes. "I have always cared for you," he said. "But caring for you did not give me the right to interrupt your choice. When you were with Julian, I had no place near you. Now that you've come to me, I still won't use your anger to demand an answer." He placed a pen in the center of the table. "Take it home. Have your lawyers tear it apart. Reject it tomorrow if you want. Whitmore and Bennett's existing projects will continue." I didn't touch the pen yet. My wedding was scheduled for 29 days from now. I know. The venue, guests, and most of the arrangements are already in place. A faint smile touched his eyes. "So, I don't want a rushed marriage to prove I didn't lose," I said. "But I also don't want to pretend we met today." He waited. "We've worked together for 5 years. I know how you respond to a loss. I know how you treat employees. I know whether you honor a promise when there is no immediate advantage in doing so. I rejected you 2 years ago not because you were unworthy, but because I had already chosen someone else." I turned the agreement back to the first page. "I made one bad choice. That doesn't make every choice after it impulsive." "What do you want?" he asked. "Both legal teams review this tonight. Tomorrow, we announce the engagement and the new strategic partnership together. The wedding remains in 29 days. But until the ceremony, either of us can walk away without punishment. No breakup fee. No business consequence." "Exactly," he added. "I agree." He didn't reach for my hand. Instead, he wrote one additional clause in the margin. "A withdrawal from the marriage commitment by either party shall not alter any existing commercial contract." That was when I understood the difference between this agreement and the one I had almost entered with Julian. The difference was not wealth. It was not power. Julian had treated my willingness to stay as something he owned. Marcus made sure the door remained open before asking me to enter. Our lawyers arrived within the hour. We spent 3 hours reviewing every clause. Marcus made no additional demands about assets, but he insisted on one provision. No relative could use a personal relationship to influence executive appointments. Why that one? I asked. My mother left Whitmore when she married, he said. 20 years later, when she wanted to return to the board, there was no place left for her. She once believed being provided for was the same as being loved. Later, she learned that care and respect are not the same thing. His calm tone gave the words more weight than any romantic speech. Before signing, I sent the documents to my own attorney and my parents. At 9 o'clock that night, I took Marcus to the Bennett home. The house was quiet when we arrived. My parents had been expecting me, but not him. My mother opened the door and looked at Marcus with the careful neutrality of a woman who had built an empire from nothing and trusted no one. My mother didn't brighten at the sight of the Whitmore heir. She closed the sitting room door and asked me directly, "Are you sure Julian hasn't made you lose your mind?" "I'm sure." My father took Marcus into his study. They spoke alone for 40 minutes. When they came out, neither looked triumphant or threatened. My father handed me the agreement. "The terms are fairer than I expected," he said. "But remember this, Noah. No matter whom you marry, you are Noah Bennett first." Marcus answered before I could. "That's who I want to marry, not a piece of Bennett capital." My mother still didn't give her approval immediately. She came to me, tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, and asked softly, "Does it still hurt?" I'd planned to say no. Instead, I admitted, "A little." Years of love did not vanish because of one ugly request. What vanished in an instant was my reason to keep trusting him. The love was still there, a bruise that would take time to heal. But trust was gone, and I wasn't sure it could ever come back. My mother held me. "Hurting and going back are two different things," she said. "You're allowed to hurt slowly. You are not required to keep humiliating yourself." Marcus stood several steps away. He didn't intrude, and he didn't pretend he hadn't heard. When we left, he asked only, "Do you want to delay tomorrow's announcement?" "No. Keep the schedule." I wasn't making the decision to hide my pain. I was able to make it precisely because I'd admitted the pain existed. The next morning at 8 o'clock, Bennett Capital and Whitmore Global released a joint announcement. The first section described a jointly funded biomedical innovation campus. The second outlined a 10-year strategic partnership. The third contained one sentence. Bennett Capital CEO Noah Bennett and Whitmore Global Chairman Marcus Whitmore have confirmed their engagement. The parties will continue to operate their companies independently under a prenuptial agreement and a formal conflict of interest policy. Their wedding will take place in 28 days. The statement didn't mention Ashford Development. It didn't explain why the groom had changed. Results do not require permission from people who are no longer part of the decision. When the announcement went live, Julian was helping Theo choose bedroom curtains. Theo held up 2 fabric samples and asked whether he preferred blue-gray or warm ivory. Julian's phone vibrated again and again. His secretary, his father, the Harbor District project lead. He dismissed the calls until a financial news alert filled the screen. His eyes stopped on the words, "Wedding to proceed" on the original date. Then he saw Marcus's name. The phone slipped from his hand and struck the display table. Theo flinched. "Julian, what happened?" Julian snatched up the phone and called me. Once, twice, 10 times. I didn't answer. Then his father called again. The moment Julian picked up, Richard Ashford's voice exploded through the speaker. "What did you do to Noah?" Bennett withdrew the Harbor District guarantee. 2 vendors are reviewing our terms, and the bank has frozen the expanded credit facility. "She's angry," Julian said. "I'll go talk to her." "Angry?" His father's voice shook. "He signed a public partnership with Whitmore while you were using Bennett's name to spend a month playing house with another man. And you still think he's angry?" The call ended. Julian turned toward the exit. Theo caught his wrist. "You told me he would never end the engagement. I need to fix this." "What about our 30 days? Julian yanked his arm free. "Who cares about 30 days now?" For the first time, all softness left Theo's face. He looked at Julian with something that might have been contempt. or might have been recognition. Recognition that Julian had never really loved him either. Not enough. Julian drove to Bennett Capital so fast that he left his car crooked in a no-parking zone. The lobby was crowded with reporters, employees, and partners. A huge screen displayed renderings of the biomedical campus. In the main image, I stood at a signing table in a white suit. Marcus stood beside me. We weren't embracing. We weren't performing romance. We simply looked like two people willing to carry the same decision. Julian tried to force his way through the security gates. "Get Noah down here." His voice turned heads throughout the lobby. I'd just left a board meeting and stepped out of the private elevator in time to see him shove past a guard. He crossed the marble floor toward me. "What is this supposed to mean? Was the announcement unclear? You agreed to let me stay with Theo yesterday, and today you're engaged to Marcus Whitmore? This is revenge." I looked at the fury in his eyes and remembered the same certainty on his face in the tailor's shop when he told me to be mature and reasonable. "You chose to honor an old promise. I chose a more suitable marriage. We're both taking responsibility for our own lives. That seems fair." "It isn't the same." "How?" His mouth opened, but no answer came. What he wanted to say was simple. He was allowed to test another life before marriage, while I was supposed to remain exactly where he left me. He'd never imagined I would do anything else. I was patient, accommodating, always willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I'd built my whole life around being the Omega who didn't cause scenes. "Nothing happened between Theo and me," he said more quietly. "I can make him leave today. We've been together for 4 years, Noah. You can't destroy everything over one misunderstanding. Whether you slept with him is not the point." I stepped closer, keeping my voice low enough that it belonged to us, but clear enough that he couldn't pretend not to understand. "The point is that you walked into a tailor's shop while I was wearing my wedding suit and told me another man's promise mattered more than ours. You expected me to accept being replaced for 30 days. You also expected Bennett Capital to keep carrying Ashford Development's risk while you did it." The color drained from his face. "You weren't confused," I said. "You simply calculated that I would give in. I never used you. Ashford received preferred status, extended vendor terms, and an intended guarantee because we were expected to become a permanent, closely supervised alliance. Which of those benefits had nothing to do with our future?" He said nothing. "The engagement is over. Every project now follows ordinary market rules. Bennett has not attacked Ashford. Bennett has stopped protecting Ashford from the consequences of its own balance sheet. If your company cannot survive without my company's reputation, that is an operating problem. It is not proof that I owe you a marriage." That was when fear finally replaced anger in his eyes. His alpha scent turned sour, acrid with panic. He reached for my wrist, the way he used to whenever he wanted to keep me in place long enough to wear down my resistance. His grip was too tight, the kind of hold that was supposed to remind me who was in control. I stepped back. Measured footsteps sounded behind me. Marcus came to my side, but he didn't move in front of me. He stood half a step away, close enough to make his position clear and far enough to leave the conversation mine. His alpha scent was steady, calm, a quiet counterpoint to Julian's desperation. Julian stared at him. "You were waiting for this." Marcus's voice was even. "I waited for Noah to choose me. I did not wait for you to fail him. You're taking advantage of him." "I invited him," I said. The lobby fell silent. "You asked for 30 days, Julian. I gave them to you. What I did not give you is the right to freeze my life until you decided whether you preferred it." His lips trembled. "I can change. That no longer matters." I turned toward the elevators. Behind me, his voice cracked. "Do you even love him?" I stopped. "I trust him." Sometimes trust is a stronger beginning for a marriage than love built on excuses. Before the elevator doors closed, I saw Julian standing in the middle of the lobby, finally understanding that he hadn't lost a wedding that could be rescheduled. He'd lost a man who would never wait for him again. The first crisis at Ashford Development hit the Harbor District project. Ashford executives assumed Bennett's decision was a pressure tactic. They continued preparing documents as if the guarantee would appear after Julian apologized. Then the bank formally paused the expanded credit facility. For months, Bennett had helped streamline due diligence to protect the construction schedule. We'd issued a non-binding letter indicating that a guarantee might be considered once the joint governance structure was in place. After the engagement ended, the letter was withdrawn. The lender requested additional collateral. Vendors returned Ashford's terms from 90 days to 30. Ashford Development didn't collapse overnight. It simply lost every convenience it had spent 2 years borrowing from Bennett's credit. Without those conveniences, weaknesses that had been disguised as growth became visible. Cash reserves were thin. Receivables were late. Several land purchases had been financed with short-term debt that required continuous refinancing. Shareholders demanded answers. Ashford's board opened a review of Julian's management decisions. Richard Ashford suspended him as chief operating officer and took control of Harbor District himself. 3 days after the announcement, Julian's mother came to the Bennett home. At our engagement party, Margaret Ashford had held my hands and told me I was already the son she'd always wanted. Now she sat across from me and pushed the gold signet ring across the coffee table. Julian was confused by Theo, she said, eyes shining. People make mistakes in long relationships. You cannot throw away years of preparation over one terrible decision. I didn't touch the velvet box. Mrs. Ashford, Julian, and I were not married. But everyone knew you were going to become part of our family, which is exactly why he should not have asked to audition another man for the role. Her expression tightened. Theo lost his father young. He's always been fragile. Julian was trying to help him. You have so much, Noah. Why compete with a boy who has so little? I'm not competing with him. I pushed the box back. I'm refusing to marry a man who needs to sacrifice his fiancé's dignity in order to feel compassionate. The sympathy disappeared from her face. Then, as I'd expected, she stopped talking about love and moved to Harbor District. Whatever happens personally, Bennett could restore the indication of support. The project should not be punished. My father had been silent until then. If Noah restored the guarantee, he asked, would Julian immediately end his 30 days with Theo? Margaret said nothing. The silence told us everything. The Ashford family didn't want my respect restored. They wanted Bennett's resources returned. When she left, she abandoned the ring on the table. I had our attorney send it back with the engagement ring, every Ashford family gift, and the formal notice terminating the engagement. Not one item remained. Julian appeared at Bennett Capital 3 days in a row. He had no appointment and never made it past security. On the 4th day, he used a private number. I made Theo leave. The 30-day promise is over. Come back and I will apologize publicly. I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, Theo sent a photograph from another number. 2 matching mugs stood on the table, and Julian's shirt hung over the arm of the sofa. Julian is upset right now, but I'm still the person he cannot let go. You have Marcus now. Isn't this best for everyone? I blocked the number. Theo wanted me to fight. He wanted proof that Julian remained a prize 2 men were desperate to win. But Julian had left my list of choices the moment I walked out of the tailor's shop. Marcus never asked whether I was still hurting. He never used Julian's behavior to make himself look kinder. He focused on the biomedical campus. We held 3 closed-door sessions in 1 week. He challenged my research funding proposal and refused to approve a number simply because we were engaged. One night, the argument lasted past midnight. I wanted 12% of Phase 1 profit committed to rare disease research. Whitmore's finance team argued that the percentage was too high during the first operating cycle. Marcus didn't support me out of loyalty. He ordered both teams to build 3 new models. 2 hours later, he pushed the final projection across the table. 12% is possible, he said. But the research fund gets an independent audit committee. You chair it. I retain 1 veto on expenditures outside the approved mandate. Deal. After everyone left, I returned to my office. A small grow light had appeared beside the pot hose on the windowsill. The old leaves were still yellow, but a small green shoot had pushed through near the roots. Marcus stood in the doorway holding 2 coffees that had already gone lukewarm. Maya says you forget to open the blinds when you're working. So you bought my plan a lamp? I considered replacing it. He glanced at the new leaf. Then I realized it wasn't necessary. I took the coffee from him. That was the first time I truly smiled in his presence. You didn't have to do that, I said, gesturing to the grow light. He shrugged. You've had that plant for 5 years. It seemed important. It's just a plant. Nothing you keep for 5 years is just anything. I looked at him differently after that. I'd always respected his mind, his integrity, his steady presence. But this small, thoughtful gesture was something else. It was evidence of someone who paid attention, someone who noticed the things I didn't say. We visited the wedding venue the following afternoon. The banquet manager apologized 3 times when she heard the groom had changed. Marcus didn't ask the staff to erase every trace of Julian, as if pretending the past had never happened. He only asked them to remove the Ashford Development branding from the corporate reception displays. The planner suggested a dramatic engagement photo shoot to control the public narrative. I hadn't answered before Marcus looked at me. Do you want that? No. I don't want the wedding to look like a product launch. Then we won't do it. The planner hesitated. People are comparing the 2 men online. A powerful image would help establish the story. Marcus's expression didn't change. Our wedding is not responsible for proving who won. In the end, we released one simple photograph. We stood beside the Charles River. We weren't embracing. I was holding a revised ceremony schedule, and Marcus had turned his head to listen to something I was saying. The most repeated comment beneath the photo was not about revenge or wealth. They look like 2 people who will actually make decisions together. For the first time, that felt closer to my idea of marriage than any image of a prince rescuing a man in a white dress. Later, Marcus studied me for a moment. Are we still keeping the original wedding date? Do you want to postpone? I'm afraid you may be using the ceremony to prove you didn't lose. His honesty made me quiet. Are you using the marriage to prove you beat Julian? I asked. No. He answered without hesitation. Julian was never my opponent. Whether you are able to trust me is the only thing I have at stake. He continued. If you need 6 months or a year, we can remain engaged and proceed with the business partnership. No contract will be withdrawn. No one will blame you. You waited 2 years. Wouldn't that feel unfair? Waiting was my choice. It is not a debt you owe me. Dawn was beginning to color the windows of my office. I understood then that safety didn't come from a man powerful enough to destroy your enemies. It came from a man who had power and still respected the line around your life. The wedding stays, I said. Are you sure? Yes. I looked at the new leaf beside the window. Not because I need to prove I didn't lose. Because this time I know what I'm choosing. 12 days before the wedding, the Ashford family began feeding stories to several public relations firms. Anonymous accounts claimed Bennett and Whitmore had been negotiating behind Julian's back for months. Other posts suggested I'd wanted Marcus first and had used Theo as an excuse to abandon Ashford Development. One gossip site described Julian's month with Theo as compassionate support for a man suffering from depression. It described my decision as a cold businessman exploiting a vulnerable friend's illness. Richard Ashford called me personally. Julian was wrong, he said. But Bennett and Ashford have worked together for years. This should not end because of a private relationship. I turned a page in the legal file before me. Are we discussing contracts or relationships? A pause. Both can be discussed. On contracts, Bennett has not breached a single obligation. On relationships, Julian asked me to accept him living with another man for 30 days. Which part would you like me to restore? His voice hardened. Dragging this into the press helps no one. That is advice the Ashford family should follow. After the call, I authorized our communications team to publish a timeline. No insults. No emotional language. Only 4 verified facts. The engagement date. The time Julian proposed the 30-day arrangement. The time Bennett's board revoked Ashford's preferred status. And the time Marcus and I began negotiations and signed the prenuptial framework. At the bottom was a screenshot of a message Julian had sent Theo after leaving the tailor's shop. He agreed. No scene. The wedding will happen after the 30 days. We hadn't hacked his phone. Theo had posted the exchange to a private social media account to impress his friends, then deleted it. Several people had saved the full image. The narrative reversed within an hour. People understood that Julian had not been free after an engagement ended. He'd assumed the engagement could be paused without consequences. He intended to keep Bennett's financial support and Theo's affection at the same time. Ashford Development's board called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Julian tried to describe the crisis as an overreaction to a private matter. A long-serving director threw the financial report onto the table. If this company were healthy, why would withdrawing an unsigned indication of support stop the project? You do not get to blame Bennett for refusing to carry a risk you should have managed. Another director asked, before deciding to live with Theo Vance, did you evaluate which contract assumptions would fail if the engagement ended? Julian couldn't answer. He'd never calculated the cost of losing me because he'd never believed I would leave. The board suspended his remaining management authority and ordered Richard Ashford to submit a refinancing and asset disposition plan. The same day, Theo moved out of the riverfront penthouse. He left the matching mugs but took the lease deposit Julian had paid for his photography studio and a high-limit supplementary credit card. Julian followed him into the underground garage. Why are you leaving? Theo opened his car door. You promised to let us see the life we missed. But every day you call Noah, and now you've lost your job because of him. We already have the answer. You said this promise mattered more than anything. A promise from high school doesn't pay my rent. Before closing the door, he looked at Julian with none of his former fragility. Stop pretending you were noble, Julian. You agreed to this because you were certain Noah would never go. You thought there would be no price. His car disappeared up the ramp, leaving Julian alone under the fluorescent lights. Perhaps that was the moment he finally understood that Theo hadn't loved only him. But it didn't reduce his responsibility. He was the one who opened the door. 6 days before the wedding, Julian waited beside my car in Bennett Capital's underground garage. He looked thinner. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes shadowed. In the past, he'd always looked perfectly arranged, as though image itself were proof of control. Security moved forward. I signaled for them to remain at a distance. Julian opened his palm. My old engagement ring lay there. I came to return this. It belongs to your family. Keep it or give it to the attorneys. He closed his fingers around it. I keep thinking about the tailor's shop. If I hadn't brought Theo there, would we still be getting married? I gave him the truth. Probably. Hope flashed across his face. But that doesn't mean the marriage would have been good, I said. The tailor's shop only let me see earlier what I'd spent years refusing to see. You believed my silence had no cost. He lowered his head. I know I was wrong. Do you regret losing me or losing Bennett's support? His lips parted. He didn't answer. The silence answered for him. Give me another chance. I looked at the man I'd once expected to spend my life with. I felt no victory, no hatred. Only the quiet that comes when a relationship is finally over. Your 30 days are not finished, I said. Ours ended on the 1st. His eyes reddened. Do you really not love me at all? I did. I wouldn't erase my own past to punish him. I loved you enough to spend 4 years inventing explanations for your behavior. I'm not doing that anymore. I walked past him. He didn't follow. When I was several steps away, he asked, Is Marcus really better than me? I stopped. He doesn't need to be better than you. I looked back once. He only needs to be right for me. The morning of the wedding was clear and bright. We kept the lakeside hotel I'd booked a month earlier. The flowers changed from champagne roses to white ranunculus and deep green branches. The guest list was reviewed from the beginning, and every Ashford name was removed. I didn't wear the silk suit from Newberry Street. The new suit was simpler, clean lines, and no heavy tailoring. I could walk up the steps alone. No one needed to carry the weight behind me. Before the ceremony, Marcus waited outside the bridal suite. He didn't come in to rush me. Through the half-open door, he asked final confirmation. You can still walk away. The makeup artist and my groomsmen stared at him. I lifted my jacket and went to the doorway. Mr. Whitmore, are you advising the groom to cancel his own wedding? I'm making sure you don't continue only because the guests have arrived. I held out my hand. I'm continuing because I want to. He took it. His palm was warm and steady. He didn't hold tightly enough to make leaving impossible. He didn't hold so loosely that I felt temporary. The chapel doors opened. Sunlight poured through the glass wall and scattered across white petals. The guests rose, but I didn't wonder where Julian was. I didn't wonder whether the ceremony looked like revenge from the outside. I saw Marcus waiting at the end of the aisle. He wasn't waiting as a rescuer. He was waiting as an equal choice. During the vows, he said, I will respect your work, your judgment, and your boundaries. I will not define happiness for you or ask you to prove love through sacrifice. I will stand beside you when you want a partner, and I will face you honestly when we disagree. When it was my turn, I looked into his eyes. I promised not to retreat when partnership is required. I promised to tell the truth when we disagree. And I promised never again to disguise silence and endurance as grace. When the ring settled onto my finger, wind moved through the trees outside. The leaves whispered against one another. After the reception, a message arrived from an unknown number. Congratulations. I'm sorry. I read it once and deleted it. Sometimes an apology matters because the person who caused the harm finally admits what he did. That does not mean the person he hurt is required to return. 1 year later, the first phase of the Biomedical Innovation Campus opened. Bennett Capital managed research investment and risk control. Whitmore Global handled infrastructure and international distribution. Marcus and I still argued in board meetings. Sometimes neither of us could persuade the other, and both teams had to rebuild the data from the beginning. Marriage didn't erase either name. Financial reports described the project as a partnership between Bennett Capital and Whitmore Global. They didn't call me Mr. Whitmore helping his husband develop a campus. The project wasn't always smooth. 3 weeks before the pilot launch, an overseas equipment supplier demanded an 18% price increase, blaming currency and manufacturing costs. Whitmore's operations team wanted to accept part of the increase to protect the launch date. Bennett's research division wanted to replace the supplier completely. Marcus and I argued for an entire evening. He didn't surrender because I was his husband. I didn't interpret his opposition as a lack of love. The next morning, we returned with separate teams. Whitmore used its logistics network to shorten the delivery time for alternative equipment. Bennett rebuilt the technical validation process. We kept the launch date and reduced the total cost. At the press conference, a reporter asked Marcus, "Does managing a major project as a married couple make it difficult to separate business judgment from private loyalty?" He didn't answer for me. He handed me the microphone. "Our private relationship makes us willing to hear each other to the end," I said. "Our governance structure makes sure we do not have to agree with every word." The answer was quoted by several business publications. That was what we truly built together. Not a wedding designed to humiliate an ex-fiancé. A life that did not require either person to disappear in order for the relationship to survive. After the press conference, I returned to my office and found the pothos spreading across the window frame. The first yellow leaves still clung near the soil, their edges brown and thin. Above them, new vines reached toward the light, each leaf wider than the last. Marcus placed a glass of warm water beside my hand and looked at the plant. "Should we cut off the old leaves?" I shook my head. "Leave them. They're not stopping the new growth." The past didn't have to be erased to lose its power. Outside, Boston's lights came on one by one. I closed the final report, and Marcus and I left the office together. We walked through the financial district, past the towers that bore our names. He reached for my hand, not to pull me closer, not to claim me, just to hold it. I heard occasionally that Julian had left Ashford Development's executive team. He began again with a small construction project far from Harbor District. He never contacted me, and he never told the press how much he regretted what he'd done. That was his life to rebuild. It had nothing to do with mine. I finally understood that leaving is not making the person who betrayed you kneel in the rain. It is not standing beside a richer man to prove you won. Leaving is reaching the point where the person who hurt you can appear again, and you no longer need his suffering to confirm your value. Julian chose 30 days with an old dream. I chose from the very first day to take my life back. That evening, Marcus and I sat in the quiet of our apartment. The city glittered beyond the windows, 1,000 lights that belonged to no one and everyone. I looked at the potholes on the sill, the old leaves still yellow, the new ones reaching for the light. "Thank you," I said. He turned toward me, waiting, for not making me pay for choosing wrong the first time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the space between us and took my hand. "I didn't wait for you to be right," he said. "I waited for you to be ready." I looked at our hands, intertwined on the table. His alpha scent was warm and steady, nothing like Julian's had ever been. Julian's scent had always felt like a performance, calculated, controlled, designed to produce a specific effect. Marcus just smelled like himself. "Is it still scary?" I asked. "Being with me? After everything?" He considered the question seriously. I liked that about him. He never rushed to comfort me with easy answers. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But fear is just information. It doesn't have to make the decision." I laughed, surprising myself. "That sounds like something you'd put in a board presentation." "Maybe I will." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Risk assessment for marriage. Section 1, emotional exposure. Section 2, asset protection. Section 3, reasonable worst-case scenario. Don't forget the appendices. I never do. He pulled me closer, and I let him. His arms wrapped around me, and for the first time in months, I let myself relax completely. I'd spent so long being strong, being rational, being the Omega who didn't make a scene. I was tired of performing. Marcus didn't need me to perform. "I love you," I said quietly. He held me tighter. "I know. I love you too. But you don't have to say it just because I said it first." "I'm not. I mean it." He pulled back to look at me. His eyes searched mine, looking for something. Maybe evidence of performance, maybe just reassurance. He must have found what he was looking for, because he kissed me softly. "The first time I met you," he said, "you were so angry about that acquisition. You stood in front of the whole regulatory committee and told me I'd made a 40% error in my compliance projections. You were right, by the way. I know. I thought, there's a man who doesn't care about being liked. Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest compliment I can give." He smiled. "Most people spend their whole lives trying to be liked. You've always been willing to be respected instead. It's one of the things he paused, searching for the right word. "Admire. It's one of the things I admire most about you." I leaned into him. "I admire you too. For not giving up. For waiting. For—" I gestured vaguely at the apartment, the plant, everything. "For all of it. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a choice." "What's the difference?" He thought about it. "A sacrifice is giving up something you want. A choice is putting your energy towards something you want more." I looked at him for a long moment. I'd spent 4 years with a man who thought loving me was a sacrifice. I was done with that. "I want this," I said. "I want us." "Good." He kissed my forehead. "Because I'm not going anywhere." We sat together in the quiet, watching the city lights flicker. The pothose stretched toward the grow light, its new leaves bright and green. I still had the old yellow leaves at the bottom, reminders of days when I'd forgotten to care for myself. But they didn't define the plant anymore. And they didn't define me. Julian's 30 days had come and gone. He'd gotten exactly what he asked for. Time with Theo, freedom to explore his old dream. What he hadn't gotten was the version of me that would wait around for him to come back. That version was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love wasn't about endurance. It was about choice. Marcus and I had chosen each other. Not because we had to, not because it was convenient, but because we wanted to. That was the difference. That was everything. The next morning, I woke up next to him for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the edges of his face. He was still asleep, his features relaxed in a way they never were at work. I watched him for a moment, trying to imprint the image in my memory. This was my life now. Not the life I'd planned, but the life I'd chosen. The life I was building, day by day, with someone who saw me clearly and didn't look away. I reached for the pothose on the windowsill and gently touched one of the new leaves. It was bright and green, full of promise. The old leaves were still there too, yellowed and withered. But they weren't the point anymore. The point was the new growth. The point was moving forward. Marcus stirred beside me, blinking awake. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I said. He smiled, slow and warm. "Nervous? About what?" "First official day as a married man." I thought about it. I thought about the board meetings and the arguments, the late nights and the early mornings. I thought about everything we'd built together and everything we'd still build. I thought about Julian, standing in that tailor's shop, so certain he could have everything he wanted without paying the price. "No," I said. "Not nervous." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm ready." And I meant it. He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. "We're going to make mistakes, you know. I'm going to mess up. You're going to mess up. We're going to argue and fight, and probably say things we don't mean. I know, but we're going to keep choosing each other. Promise." He lifted my hand to his lips and kissed it. "Promise." We lay there together, watching the sun climb higher over Boston. The city was waking up, lights flickering on in windows across the skyline. Somewhere out there, Julian was probably waking up too, facing the consequences of his choices. Somewhere out there, Theo was building his new life, the money from Julian's credit card already spent. Somewhere out there, people were talking about us, the wedding, the scandal, the billionaire divorce. I didn't care. All of that was background noise. What mattered was here, in this room, in this moment. Marcus pulled me closer, and I let him. His warmth seeped into me, steady and sure. I closed my eyes and listened to his breathing, slow and even. The past was over. The future was unwritten. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be.